The sun beat down on Silver Creek, Arizona, turning every breath into fire and every shadow into gold. By noon, the wind carried only dust and trouble. 3 riders came through the canyon, faces hidden, greed plain as daylight. They rode for Emily Brooks' land, a lonely patch of earth guarding the only water for miles. They thought she was just a girl. They thought she'd beg, but they were wrong. Twice. From the porch of an old mining cabin, Jack Carter, a drifter with too many ghosts, watched in silence. Beside him, his German shepherd Coda stood still, ears sharp, breath steady, waiting for one word. When the first man drew his pistol, the desert held its breath. And somewhere between heat and dust, justice woke up again in Silver Creek. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story of courage and loyalty stirs your heart, please subscribe and join our campfire of tales from the old American West. The desert around Silver Creek, Arizona burned like a forge at the edge of the known world. The summer sun didn't shine, it punished. Every rock shimmered, every cactus cast a hard black shadow, and the air itself trembled like it wanted to escape. The year was 1887, and Silver Creek was little more than a few weathered buildings crouched along a dirt road. A saloon with a sagging roof, a half-dead blacksmith shop, and a handful of stubborn souls who refused to let the desert win. The wind carried dust and stories, and sometimes it was hard to tell which lasted longer. That morning, Jack Carter stood at the edge of town, where the baked earth met the endless horizon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a man whose silhouette always seemed to stand against the sun. His hair was dark and coarse, his beard neatly trimmed but heavy enough to shadow a square jaw carved by years of hard living. His face bore faint scars, not the kind that told of vanity, but of survival. He had the quiet eyes of someone who had seen too much war and too little peace. Once, he had worn a soldier's uniform, maybe for a cause, maybe for a paycheck. Even he wasn't sure anymore. Now he wore dust, denim, and the kind of silence that made others uneasy. At his side padded Coda, a 5-year-old German shepherd, tall and sinewy with a coat of black and fawn that shimmered under the cruel sun. His ears twitched with constant awareness, his amber eyes always scanning, calculating. Coda wasn't just trained, he was bonded to Jack in a way no man could fully understand. The dog had served in the army with him, through battles no one back home had even heard of. Since then, they'd both been searching for something like peace, though neither of them knew what it looked like. Jack had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of Silver Creek, more a pile of wood with ambition than a home, hoping to stay invisible. But peace never lasted long in places where greed ran deeper than water. On the far side of town, near the dry wash that cut through the hills, stood the Brooks Ranch, a small patch of stubborn green in a sea of dust. The owner, Emily Brooks, was 20, though the desert had aged her into someone who carried herself like 30. She was tall for a woman, slender but strong from years of work, her skin sun-bronzed, her hair the color of burnt honey, always tied in a loose braid that refused to behave. Her eyes were sharp blue, the kind of eyes that could shame a man into standing straighter. She'd inherited the land from her father, a miner who died chasing gold and left her only a farmhouse, a well, and a debt no banker wanted, but every outlaw coveted. That day, as the town's church bell echoed weakly through the heat, Emily was hanging laundry when she saw dust rising on the trail. 3 riders moving slow but certain. Trouble didn't gallop in Silver Creek. It came steady, wearing a smile. The man in front was Milo Crane, foreman for the railroad tycoon Silas Vane. Milo was tall and wiry, with sunburned skin stretched tight over cheekbones that looked carved from bone. His hair was slicked back with grease, and a patchy beard covered a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. People said he used to be a lawman until he shot the wrong man, or the right one depending on who told the story. Since then, he'd found easier work scaring people off their own land. "Morning, Miss Brooks," he drawled, tipping his sweat-stained hat as he dismounted. "Fine day for business. Mr. Vane sent me to discuss your property again." Emily didn't stop hanging the sheet. "I told him already. The land isn't for sale." Milo chuckled. "Oh, it's for sale, all right. You just don't know the price yet." Behind him, his 2 men, rough-necked drifters with rifles slung lazy, laughed. The sound carried far in the dry air. From his cabin half a mile away, Coda's ears perked. The dog lifted his head, growling low, a vibration more felt than heard. Jack glanced up from the saddle he was oiling, brow furrowed. "What is it, boy?" The dog stood, tail stiff, eyes fixed toward the ranch. Jack followed his gaze and saw the dust cloud. He sighed, slid his revolver into its holster, and muttered, "So much for quiet." By the time Jack reached the fence line, Milo had already grabbed Emily's arm. She twisted free, her voice steady but furious. "Get off my land, Crane!" Milo's smirk hardened. "You think you can talk to me like that?" He raised his hand, but before it fell, a voice cut through the heat. "Let her go!" Milo turned. Jack stood 10 paces away, one hand resting lazily on his gun belt. His tone was even, but his eyes were hard enough to stop a storm. Coda stood beside him, muscles coiled, teeth just barely showing. Milo sneered. "This your business, stranger?" Jack's reply was quiet. "It is now." One of Milo's men reached for his pistol. Coda moved first, a streak of muscle and fury, hitting the man square in the chest. The outlaw went down screaming as Coda's jaws clamped on his sleeve, ripping it clean. Jack's hand blurred. His revolver cracked once, kicking up dust inches from the other man's boots. Milo froze. Sweat glistened on his temple. For a heartbeat, the desert went silent again. Jack spoke low. "You and your boys ride out of here. Tell Vane if he wants this land, he can dig his own grave to claim it." Milo spat, backing toward his horse. "You'll regret this, stranger." "Maybe," Jack said, holstering his gun. "But not today." When the riders vanished in a trail of dust, Emily stood breathing hard, her knuckles white around the hem of her apron. Coda, panting, looked proud of himself until Jack shot him a dry look. The dog, unbothered, trotted to the saddlebag and stole a strip of jerky, chewing loudly. Emily laughed despite herself. "He's got good taste." Jack's lips twitched. "Yeah, terrible manners, though." He tipped his hat and started to leave when something half buried in the dust caught his eye. A sheet of paper fluttering near the fence post. He bent, picked it up, and froze. It was a wanted poster, his face staring back, the bounty high enough to make anyone greedy. But the part that made his stomach twist wasn't the price. It was the date printed at the bottom. July 17th, 1887. Tomorrow. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of heat and iron. Jack looked toward the horizon, the poster trembling in his grip. "Now that," he muttered, "ain't right." Coda growled softly as if agreeing. The sun beat harder, and somewhere beyond the dunes, the future had already begun to move toward Silver Creek. By mid-afternoon, Silver Creek shimmered under a haze so thick it blurred the line between sky and sand. Jack Carter rode slowly beside Emily Brooks, their horses' hooves kicking up small spirals of dust that hung in the heat. Coda trotted ahead, his tongue lolling, but his ears remained sharp as spear points. The poster Jack had found that morning was folded in his coat pocket, heavy as a stone against his chest. He hadn't told Emily yet. He wasn't sure he believed it himself. The town looked even smaller in the hard daylight. Just one main street lined with tired buildings and people who had learned to keep their heads down. The painted signs had faded years ago. Dawson's Mercantile, Haven Saloon, Silver Creek Telegraph Office. Every window seemed to squint against the sun, every door barely open enough to let out a whisper of air and fear. At the far end stood the sheriff's office, a squat brick building that had seen better decades. A weathered sign read, "Eva Ross, Sheriff." Jack dismounted first and tied his horse to the post, then offered a hand to Emily. She hesitated, then took it, her calloused fingers firm but trembling slightly. Coda padded after them, glancing around, his tail stiff. A sentinel in fur. Sheriff Eva Ross was not the kind of lawman most expected. She was in her early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair once red but now streaked with silver, tied back in a no-nonsense knot. Her face was strong, not beautiful but honest, the kind that told you she had buried more friends than she cared to count. The sun had carved faint lines around her eyes, but it hadn't dulled the steel in them. She'd been a frontier deputy once, before her husband, a U.S. Marshal, was gunned down by raiders on the Santa Fe Trail. Since then, Eva had worn her badge like a promise to no one but herself. She looked up from her desk as Jack and Emily entered, brushing dust from her sleeve. "You must be the drifter I've been hearing about," she said, her voice low and steady. "The one who put Milo Crane on his backside." Jack gave a half smile. "Word travels fast for a town this small." "Bad news travels faster," she said, then nodded to Emily. "You all right, Miss Brooks?" Emily nodded. "For now." Eva gestured for them to sit. I wish I could tell you the law's on your side, she said, but around here law's been bought and sold more times than a saloon girl's smile. Jack leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. You mean Vane. Silas Vane, Eva said bitterly, owns half the railroad contracts from Prescott to Tucson, bought Judge Warren last year. Now every land dispute ends in his favor, claims it's all part of the Great Expansion, building progress across the desert. What he's building, she added, is an empire on other people's graves. Emily's hands tightened in her lap. My father always said our well water was part of a bigger spring. Maybe that's what he wants. Eva nodded. That spring runs deep under your property and keeps going west. My guess. Straight through the canyons near Coyote's Gate. Jack frowned. That's outlaw country. Used to be, Eva said. Now it's Vane's country. Jack stood and went to the window. The town stretched before him, shimmering in the heat. He spotted a wagon loaded with lumber and crates rolling down Main Street. The driver wore a fine vest too clean for desert work. The crates bore the stamp of Apex Rail and Holdings, Vane's company. Jack turned back. You got anyone who can get word out? Someone fast? Someone quiet? Eva hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out a worn telegraph slip. There's one man used to run messages for the Army. Lives near the old telegraph shack outside town. Name's Ben Riley. People call him Ghost. He's a genius with wires, but he keeps to himself. Jack's lips curved slightly. I know him. Emily looked between them. You do? Served with him once, Jack said. He can read signals faster than most men can think. If anyone can find out what Vane's really doing, it's him. An hour later, Jack rode out toward the hills west of town. The telegraph shack stood half collapsed, its roof sagging like a tired old horse. Inside, the air smelled of dust, metal, and oil. Ben Riley sat behind a desk piled with wires and gears, a man in his 30s with a lean frame, a sunburnt neck, and eyes like quicksilver that never stopped moving. His dark hair was wild, his stubble uneven, and his fingers, long and clever, danced constantly even when they weren't working. A small scar traced down his right cheek, a souvenir from a time he'd tried to hotwire a Confederate telegraph during a raid. The shock nearly killed him, and the laughter afterward nearly broke him. But he'd learned one thing. Electricity was faster than bullets. Jack Carter, he said without looking up. Either you're here for a drink or for trouble. And I'm out of whiskey. Trouble, Jack said, stepping inside. Ben finally looked up, his grin crooked. Then we're both rich. They shook hands, the kind that remembered shared dangers. Jack explained quickly. The ranch, the thugs, the water, and the name Silas Vane. Ben's grin faded. He turned to his telegraph, tapping a rhythm so fast it sounded like rain. Lines of coded reply began to tick back minutes later. Thought so, Ben muttered. Your spring runs under a canyon called Coyote's Gate. I intercepted a message last week. Vane's buying explosives and hiring ex-soldiers to secure the site. That's not a resort he's building. That's a smuggler's port. Jack's jaw tightened. He's turning the desert into a highway for contraband. Ben leaned back. And using the law to guard it. Clever bastard. Back in town, Emily sat on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching wagons roll by. Dawson's Mercantile had just doubled prices on flour and sugar. Supply problems, the owner had said, smiling too wide. She could feel the change in the air, a quiet fear moving like a dust storm you couldn't see, only taste. By sundown, Jack returned with Ben riding beside him and Coda trotting close. Eva was waiting, arms crossed. Find anything useful? Jack nodded. Vane's after the spring. It runs all the way to Coyote's Gate. He's not laying tracks. He's laying cover. Eva cursed under her breath. The judge will never sign a warrant. Jack's voice was steady. Then we'll make our own kind of law. The sheriff looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. Just remember, Carter, when the law dries up, men start bleeding for water. Emily's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the sun was dying in a red blaze. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Water keeps life alive, but it also brings men to kill for it. The wind blew hot across the street, lifting a single scrap of paper, a poster fluttering by Jack's boot. He bent to pick it up, but it was blank this time, the ink scorched clean by the sun. He stared at it, puzzled. Seems even the desert plays tricks. he murmured. Coda barked once, sharp and low, as if the wind had whispered something only he could hear. The road to Coyote's Gate was a narrow scar running through the desert, a trail carved by centuries of wind and regret. The air was sharp with heat and the smell of sagebrush. Even the crows had given up flying, choosing to sit on fence posts and pant in the sun. Jack Carter rode ahead, his broad back straight, his eyes narrow beneath the brim of his hat. The desert had a way of stripping a man down to what he really was. And under this light, there were no secrets, only dust and truth. Beside him, Ben Riley swayed in the saddle, his shirt clinging with sweat, his wiry frame barely holding together under the heat. "Next time," he muttered, "we do this in winter." Jack gave a dry grin. "Next time, you're buying the horses." Coda trotted beside them, his coat glinting gold in the light. He was restless today, tail low, ears twitching, his steps too quiet. Every few minutes he'd stop, nose lifted to the air, then look back with a low, uneasy growl. Jack trusted that instinct more than maps. Ahead, the canyon rose like the open jaws of a stone beast. Two walls of red rock curved inward, meeting above in jagged arches. Coyote's Gate. The locals called it cursed. It was a place where the sun never quite reached the floor and sound seemed to bend. At the base of the canyon, a small stream cut through the dust, proof of the underground spring Emily's father had once spoken of. Around it, the evidence was clear. Boot prints, wagon ruts, the blackened remains of campfires. Jack crouched and ran his fingers along the ground. "They've been moving goods through here," he said quietly, "and not small stuff either. Heavy crates, probably weapons or opium." Ben knelt beside him, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Pinkerton-style guards, maybe. Vane doesn't hire drunks." They didn't wait long for proof. From the ridge above came the faint metallic click of a rifle bolt. Jack froze, hand hovering near his holster. Coda stiffened, fur rising like a shadow made of muscle. Through the heat shimmer, a shape moved. A man lean and professional, with a black coat and the unmistakable swagger of a hired gun. He wasn't alone. Three figures emerged, spaced perfectly apart, moving with silent precision. Their leader was Elias Crow, a name whispered in border towns. He was a tall man with a hawk's face and eyes the color of a dying storm. A jagged scar crossed his chin and disappeared into a week's worth of gray stubble. Once he'd been a Pinkerton detective, until he killed a suspect in custody and vanished into the desert. Now he sold his aim to whoever paid most. His voice was dry as gravel. "You boys seem lost," he called from the ridge. "This is private land." Jack's hand dropped to his revolver. "Then maybe your boss ought to post a sign." Crow smirked. "Vane doesn't like signs. He prefers graves." The first shot cracked like lightning, a warning that missed Jack's hat by inches. Ben dove behind a rock, muttering something about hating adventure. Coda leapt forward before Jack could stop him, barking once, then vanishing into the brush. The gunmen turned their rifles, confused by the sudden echoing sound. Jack used that heartbeat to move, rolling behind a boulder and firing twice. One bullet hit a rock near Crow's boot. The other clipped the brim of another man's hat. The mercenaries ducked, shouting. "Ben!" Jack yelled. "Cut the wire!" Ben's hands were already working. He'd found a half-hidden telegraph pole beside the canyon wall, its wire humming faintly. With his knife, he sliced it clean, sparks flashing in the sun. Then, with the speed of a man who thought in circuits, he rerouted the line through his pocket transmitter, a small brass device covered in etched runes of Morse code. "Let's see how Mr. Vane likes fake news," he muttered. Within seconds, he was tapping out a false report. "Site compromised. Retreat to North Pass immediately." The message would travel to Vane's camp miles away, scattering his guards like ants kicked from a nest. Meanwhile, Jack improvised a trap. From his saddlebag, he pulled a set of signal mirrors, small, polished glass discs left from his army days. He positioned them carefully along the canyon ridge, their surfaces catching the blinding sun. As Crow's men tried to reposition, the mirrors flashed in their eyes, turning the canyon into a chaos of glare and shadow. Jack fired again, this time shattering a rock above them. Pebbles rained down like gunfire. Crow cursed, retreating. "You've made your point, Carter," he shouted, "but this land's already bought. You can't fight the tide." Jack's voice echoed back, calm and sharp. "Tides don't last long in the desert." By dusk, the canyon was silent again. Coda returned, tail wagging proudly, his muzzle dusted with blood and cactus needles. "You all right, boy?" Jack asked. Coda dropped a man's torn hat at his boots. Ben winced. "That's one less paycheck for Crow's crew." They rode back under the orange sky, dust glowing like embers. Near town, the people of Silver Creek were already doing their quiet part. Old Dawson, the merchant with a limp and a conscience, had accidentally shipped Vane's food crates to the wrong station. A pair of teenage stable boys had deflated the wheels of Vane's wagons. Even Sister Agnes, the town's white-haired nun who ran the chapel, had filled her evening prayers with lines about the wolves who drink from others' wells. Later that night, under the red glow of a lantern, Jack taught Emily how to hold a rifle. She stood barefoot on the porch, sweat streaking her sunburned face, determination gleaming in her eyes. Her hands trembled at first. "It's heavier than I thought," she murmured. Jack adjusted her stance gently. "Everything worth protecting usually is." When she fired, the shot hit a tin can dead center. Coda barked, tail wagging furiously. Ben leaned against the fence, grinning. "Maybe she's better than you, Jack." Coda suddenly snatched Ben's hat and bolted, tail high. The telegrapher chased after him, shouting and tripping over a bucket. Emily laughed for the first time in days, a bright, human sound against the endless hum of crickets. When the laughter faded, Jack looked toward the desert. The stars were rising, cold and ancient. Somewhere out there, Silas Vane would soon realize he'd been played, and when he came back, he wouldn't come with wagons. He'd come with war. Jack tightened his grip on his hat. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we build stronger traps." Coda's ears twitched, as if in agreement. The storm came at dusk, the kind that rolled over the desert like a living thing, dragging the sky down with it. The wind carried red dust so thick it turned the sun into a smear of rust. Silver Creek disappeared behind a curtain of grit, and the world shrank to the reach of a lantern's glow. Inside the storm, even time seemed to hold its breath. Jack Carter stood on the porch of Emily Brooks' farmhouse, his hat pulled low, his coat snapping against his legs. He could smell trouble beneath the dust, a sour mix of gun oil and sweat that didn't belong to the desert. Beside him, Coda's fur bristled, the dog's body tense as wire, ears flat to his skull. Jack turned as Ben Riley came up from the barn, his lean frame ghosted in sand. "They're out there," Ben said, his voice a rasp. "3 groups, maybe 4, moving slow, too organized for outlaws." Jack nodded grimly. Vane's men didn't take the hint. He brought in new blood. That new blood was a crew known across Arizona as the Butchers, mercenaries who prided themselves on leaving no trace. Their leader, Harlan Pike, had once been a cavalry scout before turning his skills to the highest bidder. Pike was in his late 30s, tall and broad, with the kind of stillness that came from killing too often. His face was sun-darkened, his left eye a cloudy gray from an old bullet graze. He spoke little and never smiled. His reputation was enough to make hired guns stand straighter. To Pike, death was just another task done well. Ben wiped sand from his goggles. "We've got about 10 minutes before they're on us." Jack's eyes flicked toward the corral. "Then let's give them a welcome they'll remember." While the storm howled louder, the 2 men worked in rhythm, veterans of too many desperate nights. Jack hung lanterns along the fence posts, covering them with pieces of cloth tied to tripwires. Each lantern was rigged to burst into light when the wire was pulled, blinding anyone who came through. Ben ran bell cords through the underbrush, linking them to empty bottles and tin cans. The softest tug would turn the desert into a choir of alarms. When they finished, Jack led Emily to the cellar entrance. Her face was pale beneath the lantern glow, eyes fierce despite the fear. She wore her father's old duster, too big for her frame, and carried a Winchester rifle clutched tight. "You stay here until I call," Jack said. No arguments. She wanted to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped her. "All right," she whispered. The first sound came as a ripple in the storm. Hooves, muffled but deliberate. The Butchers advanced through the dust like shadows, 6 men moving with military precision. Pike signaled silently, his hand slicing through the air. 2 broke off toward the barn, 2 circled wide toward the creek bed, and 2, including Pike, moved straight for the house. Coda stiffened, head turning toward the left flank. Dick crouched, whispered, "Wait for my mark." The storm screamed overhead. A tripwire snapped. In an instant, 5 lanterns flared to life, their covers ripped away by the wind. The sudden explosion of light seared the darkness, catching the attackers full in the eyes. The desert, moments ago blind, became a sage of white fire. Jack opened fire. 3 warning shots that cracked like thunder. One of the butchers dove for cover. Another tripped over Ben's bell line, setting off a rattle that echoed like panic. The horses in the corral spooked, their eyes wild. Ben, grinning madly, swung the gate open and slapped the nearest stallion's flank. A herd of half-tamed mustangs burst free, thundering into the storm. They crashed through the enemy line like a flood of muscle and chaos, scattering men and rifles alike. At the edge of the porch, Pike raised his pistol. The flash of lightning lit his face. Calm, focused. He fired once. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Jack's coat, close enough to burn. Jack dropped to one knee, returning fire, hitting the ground an inch from Pike's boots. The leader didn't flinch. He moved forward step by step, the sandstorm swallowing him. Then came the low growl. Coda lunged from the shadows, striking Pike's second-in-command full in the chest. The man went down hard, his gun skidding away. Pike turned just as Jack charged. The 2 men collided, fists in grit and fury. Pike swung like a hammer, catching Jack across the jaw, but Jack countered with a headbutt that left them both bleeding. They fell in the dirt, rolling. Pike reached for his knife and froze when the cold mouth of Jack's revolver found his temple. "Call them off," Jack said, voice low and cold. Pike spat blood. "You don't understand, Carter. This isn't Vane's fight anymore." Before Jack could answer, another shot rang out. From the ridge above, the bullet hit one of Pike's men square in the leg, dropping him. Over the roar of the wind came Sheriff Eva Ross's voice. "Drop your weapons!" She emerged from the storm like judgment itself, her long coat whipping around her, a shotgun steady in her hands. Behind her, 2 deputies, one thin and nervous, the other built like a wall, flanked her, guns drawn. Pike looked around, saw his men either wounded or captured. He let his knife fall. Jack exhaled slowly, pulling him to his feet. Eva strode forward, eyes scanning the ground until they landed on a small black ledger half buried in the mud. She picked it up, wiped the dust away, and frowned at the writing. "Looks like we've got ourselves a trail," she murmured. "Names, payments, and routes. Judge Warren, Councilman Hargrove, all tied to Vane." Ben approached, pocketing his tools. "And there's more. I intercepted a coded transmission before they hit us, marked with a sigil, Aegis Co. Whoever they are, they're giving orders to Vane now. The message said, 'Clean up Silver Creek. No witnesses.'" The storm began to fade, leaving the desert still and eerie. Bodies lay bound in the sand, lanterns flickering over their faces. Jack stared toward the horizon, where the sky bled crimson. "Vane was just a pawn," he said softly. "There's a bigger hand moving the board." Eva holstered her shotgun. "Then we'd better start looking for the player." Coda padded up beside Jack, muzzle streaked with dust, tail wagging once. He looked up as if to ask if it was finally over. Jack reached down, scratching behind his ear. "Not yet, boy," he said quietly. "Not yet." The dawn over Silver Creek came red as spilled wine, bleeding across the sand and waking the desert in silence. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled of iron and gunpowder. Jack Carter stood outside the sheriff's office, his hat low against the rising sun, the grit of last night's battle still on his hands. Beside him, Coda lay stretched out in the dirt, his fur streaked with dust, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. The town was quiet. Too quiet for a place that had survived hell only hours before. From the saloon to the church steps, people began to emerge, blinking at the light, as if they weren't sure the world had survived the night. Emily Brooks was among them. Her long hair was tangled, her cheeks still streaked with grime, but her eyes were alive again, clear and fierce. She looked at Jack with something between relief and disbelief. "Is it really over?" she asked. Jack gave a tired half-smile. "It's never over, not out here, but it's quieter now." Before she could answer, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Fast, desperate. Down the main street, a single rider came barreling through the dust. Silas Vane. He was no longer the polished man of influence who sent orders from behind polished desks. His black suit was torn, one sleeve hanging loose. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and fear. The once calm gleam in his eyes had been replaced by the wild glare of a man cornered by his own empire. His lips trembled as he yanked Emily from the edge of the crowd, jerking her in front of him like a shield. "Everyone stay back!" he shouted, pressing a revolver against her temple. His voice cracked on the words, the sound more plea than threat. "Nobody moves, or she dies. You hear me?" Sheriff Eva Ross stepped out of the shadows of her doorway, shotgun leveled but steady. The morning light caught the badge on her chest, making it gleam like a piece of the sun. "Put the gun down, Silas," she said. "You've got nowhere left to go." Vane's gaze darted between them, his lips twisting. "You think I don't know that? You think the law means anything out here? You're all already dead. Aegis will clean this place off the map." Jack walked forward, slow and deliberate, his boots crunching on the dry clay. "You're scared," he said quietly. "Not of me, not of her. You're scared because you finally ran out of men to hide behind." Vane's grip on Emily tightened. "Stay back," he barked. The gun shook in his hand. Coda, crouched at Jack's heel, let out a low growl, a sound like the earth itself rumbling. Jack didn't look at him, but his voice dropped to a whisper. "Watch him." It was a phrase Coda had known since the war, a command as old as their bond. The dog moved like lightning, a blur of muscle and dust. He hit Vane's arm before the man could even pull the trigger, teeth sinking into his wrist. The revolver fired, the shot going wild, shattering the sign above Dawson's Mercantile. Emily screamed, jerking free and stumbling to the ground. Jack's gun came up. 2 shots, clean and fast. The first hit Vane in the shoulder, spinning him backward. The second struck center mass. He staggered, staring at the blood blooming across his shirt like a red flower. The revolver fell from his hand, clattering onto the ground. For a heartbeat, it was silent. Just the wind sighing between buildings. Then Vane collapsed, his breath rattling like paper in the dust. Coda stood over him, growling low, then backed away to Jack's side, muzzle flecked with red but eyes steady. Sheriff Ross moved forward, her boots leaving deep prints in the dust. She crouched, checking for a pulse, then looked up. "He's done." Her tone was flat. Not victory, just relief. She pulled a pair of iron cuffs from her belt and turned as another figure appeared at the end of the street. Judge Warren, the once proud man who had sold Silver Creek piece by piece, stumbled out of the hotel, still in his bedclothes, his face ashen. His white mustache trembled. "Eva, this is a mistake," he stammered. I didn't know." "You knew." She cut him off coldly, slapping the cuffs around his wrists. "You just didn't care." Before Warren could protest, the sharp whistle of a train echoed across the valley, a sound that didn't belong to Silver Creek. Ben Riley came running from the telegraph office, waving a piece of paper. "Federal marshals," he called out, breathless. "They're here. They got my message." Moments later, a black carriage bearing the seal of the United States appeared from the trail. 2 agents in long coats and wide hats stepping out. One was a tall man named Marshal Henry Cole, all sinew and bone with a gray beard and the piercing eyes of someone who'd spent a lifetime hunting liars. The other was Agent Lydia Hart, a younger woman with sharp cheekbones, sunburned skin, and the cold precision of a born investigator. She scanned the scene, her gloved hands steady on her notebook. Cole tipped his hat to Ross. "Looks like you folks did half our job." Ross smirked. "Happy to share the glory." Hart knelt by Vane's body, studying the wound with quiet detachment. "He was already finished," she murmured. "Aegis won't send anyone for him now. They don't retrieve failures." Ben frowned. "You mean they'll just vanish?" Hart stood. "They already have." She nodded toward the horizon, where faint tire tracks, not wagon but machine, faded into the dunes. They were here hours ago. Now they're ghosts again. The rain began just after noon, the first in months. It came soft at first, then steady, pattering against rooftops, sliding down the spines of cacti that had forgotten the feeling. The townsfolk stood in the street, faces turned upward, letting it wash the dust from their skin. For the first time in years, Silver Creek smelled of life. Jack stood under the overhang of Emily's porch, watching the desert darken with moisture. Emily joined him quietly, her hair damp, her expression unreadable. "What happens now?" she asked. Jack looked out at the rain. "You rebuild, you plant, you stay. And you?" He smiled faintly. "I was thinking of leaving." Coda, who had been lying on the porch, lifted his head and let out a soft huff, as if disagreeing. Emily laughed, a quiet, tired laugh that felt like home. Jack looked down at the dog, then back at her. but maybe I'll stay long enough to see the next rain." Inside, the fire burned low. Jack took the wanted poster from his pocket, the one that bore his face and tomorrow's date. He studied it for a long moment, then tossed it into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished in a whisper of smoke. Outside, the rain fell harder, beating against the roof like the pulse of a new beginning. And so, as the rain finally fell over Silver Creek, after all the blood, the dust, and the long silence, it felt less like weather and more like a small miracle. Maybe it wasn't just water that came from the sky that day. Maybe it was forgiveness, carried on each drop, for those who had fought, for those who had fallen, and for those still trying to find their way home. Some folks said it was just a change in the season, but others, the quiet kind, the ones who still bow their heads before sleep, believed it was God's gentle reminder that even in the driest desert, grace can still fall like rain, that He never forgets a soul who stands for what's right, even when the world feels lost. And maybe that's the lesson Silver Creek left behind, that miracles aren't thunder and light, but quiet moments of mercy. The way a wounded man finds peace, a loyal dog keeps watch, and strangers choose kindness when no one's looking. If this story touched your heart, share it, so that someone out there who's walking through their own desert might remember that faith, courage, and love still bloom, even under the hardest sun. Leave a comment below and tell us what you believe. Have you ever seen a small miracle in your life? And before we ride out, don't forget to subscribe and join our campfire of stories, tales of courage, loyalty, and the quiet ways God still moves in this wild, beautiful world. May He bless your home, your loved ones, and the road that lies ahead. And may His rain find you, wherever you are.